Ever feel like you're swimming in an ocean of information, right?
Yeah.
Just overwhelmed with stuff and really wish someone could point you to like the most important parts.
Totally, I get that.
Yeah. Well, that's what we try to do here on the deep dive. I mean, we take your sources, the ones that you're struggling with, and we try to help you find those hidden gems, the insights that might have otherwise just kind of slipped past you.
Yeah, we're like your intellectual Sherpas or something.
That's a great way to put it. So for today's deep dive, we're going to be looking specifically at pages 189 to 208 of the, what was it? Yeah, the Abacha.
Yeah,
It's,
yeah.
yeah, and we're zeroing in on X, the Wheel of Fortune. Pretty pivotal symbol in this whole system. And we want to really unpack what these pages, your pages, have to say about it.
Absolutely. It's a fascinating section, full of layers.
Okay, so we're on page 189, looking at Who X. And the first thing that jumps out is it's not just standing there by itself, right?
No, not at all.
It's part of the whole sequence. Yeah, I mean, we just came from the realm of INX.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the connection? Like, how does X flow out of what comes before it, according to these pages?
Well, if you look at the text leading up to page 189, you see that INX is presented as like this culmination of forces, almost like a resolution of the ternary dynamic, that interplay between, remember, Yod and He, the will and the environment.
Yeah, right. I'm with you.
So imagine those two, interacting, kind of weaving together towards something. IIX is essentially that, something reaching a point of, well, maturity, I guess you could say.
So it's like the final stage of that process.
Exactly.
Gotcha. So if we're thinking of it like, say, a plant reaching full bloom, then INX, starting on page 189, is what? Like the next season, or?
It's the next stage in the cycle, yeah, but it's also a bit more than that, because IX is actually the beginning of a whole new phase, a quaternary.
Quaternary, okay.
Yeah. So the ternary was all about that initial dynamic unfolding, right? But this quaternary, starting with X, it's about how that threefold energy kind of solidifies into a stable, like, system of relationships and attractions, which the book refers to as realization.
Realization. Okay, so that word usually makes me think of like suddenly grasping a concept, like, aha, I get it now. But here it seems like something way more like substantial, I guess, like something becoming real, not just understanding it.
Exactly. In these pages, realization isn't just a mental click. It's about that dynamic force from the ternary actually materializing into concrete interacting systems.
So help me out here, like a metaphor or something.
Sure, think of it like baking a cake. You've got your ingredients, your recipe, the intention to bake, that's like the ternary. But the realization, as it's described in the section on ADEX, that's the actual baking itself. The heat, the mixing, all that transforms the ingredients into an actual cake.
Okay, now I get it. So those initial forces, they become something real, tangible.
Right. And these pages suggest that this transformation involves some pretty complex phenomena. And by looking closely at the wheel, that central image, we can start to understand the principles at play here in this fourfold phase.
The wheel, yeah. It's front and center on page 190. So in the context of this realization process, what does the wheel's movement actually signify?
The wheel is super important. It's not just some random symbol. The way it constantly turns embodies that kind of flow, that cyclical nature inherent in this process of realization.
Okay.
So think about it. The wheel's movement represents the ups and downs of fortune, the interplay of all these different forces as that initial energy, solidifies into actual relationships and structures.
So it's not static, it's always moving, always in flux.
Right, and nothing stays the same either. Things are constantly rising, falling, shifting.
Makes sense.
And page 190 really emphasizes that continuous turning, that constant interplay. It's a core characteristic of this quaternary phase.
And then there's the classic image on page 191, the one with the three figures on the wheel, one going up, one at the top, and one going down. How do those figures tie into this whole cycle of realization as it's presented in these pages?
Yeah, those figures, they're not just decoration. They're like visual metaphors, key to understanding the different stages within these cycles we're talking about. So the rising figure, that symbolizes emergence, right? A period of growth and potential being unleashed.
Okay.
And then you've got the crowned figure at the very top. That represents culmination, a peak, a point where that growth reaches its maximum in that particular cycle. And then naturally, you've got the figure descending, illustrating decline, the natural downturn where what was achieved starts to, well, either transform or fade.
This is like any process in life, really. There's the initial push, the peak, and then the eventual winding down.
Exactly. And these pages use those figures to like visually represent the natural rhythms of realization.
So it's not about luck, good or bad, but about understanding that these phases are like built in to the process itself.
Exactly. And these pages really stress that. They say the cyclical movement, it's not just random, it reflects these like big universal laws of change and transformation. It's saying that everything in this framework, everything's subject to that constant flux, that impermanence. And it's not something to be afraid of, you know? It's just part of how things work.
Makes you think about where we stand in all this.
Yeah.
Are we just along for the ride on this wheel, or do we actually have a say in things?
Yeah. Do we have free will, or are we like puppets? That's the big question.
Right. So what do these pages say about individual agency, our ability to make choices within this whole framework of the box?
Well, it's interesting because while the text definitely emphasizes these powerful cyclical forces at play in realization, it doesn't say we're completely powerless. It doesn't say that we have no control whatsoever. It's more nuanced than that. You know, the choices we make as things rise and fall, as the wheel turns, those still matter. We may not be able to control the cycles themselves, but we can control how we respond to them.
Right.
And those responses matter. They shape the outcomes. That's what these pages seem to be suggesting.
So it's about awareness,
Right.
understanding these phases, and then making conscious choices within that context.
Exactly. And that's where understanding the cyclical nature, as presented in Age X, especially in pages 189 to 208, can be super helpful. If you realize that both good times and bad times are just parts of this bigger pattern, it can help you approach things with more acceptance, less resistance, less getting caught up in the ups and downs.
Yeah, finding that balance.
Right, finding that equilibrium within the flow of things. It's powerful.
Absolutely. So for someone listening right now, someone who's trying to apply this to their own life, how would they actually go about doing that, using these pages as a guide?
Well, think of a situation you're dealing with right now and look at it through the lens of that Wheel of Fortune, the one on page 190. Where is it on the cycle? Is it in a phase of growth, gaining momentum? Is it at a peak, stable and strong? Or is it maybe starting to decline, to change? And you can do this for different areas of your life, right? Your work, your relationships, personal goals. It helps to see those things in the context of their natural trajectory, as these pages explain.
That's helpful, yeah. Okay, so let's zoom out a bit. We're focusing on pages 189 to 208 here, but how does all this, the realization concept, the wheel, how does it fit into the bigger picture of the Izo-Ine?
Yeah.
Are there connections to things that were discussed earlier in the book?
Definitely. There are a lot of echoes in these pages, things building on earlier concepts. For example, the way realization is presented here, how potential turns into the actual, it really builds on that early discussion about the interplay of active and passive forces, the yad and he, remember?
Right.
The wheel itself, you could see it as like a visual representation of those forces interacting, solidifying into real outcomes.
Interesting.
And then you've got the continuous movement of the wheel on page 190, which connects to that idea that consciousness itself is this constant flow, this underlying energy driving the whole show.
Yeah.
It all ties together,
Right. It's all connected. And, this makes me think, you mentioned earlier the price of potential energy, which I know is discussed around page 256, so outside our focus here. But it makes me wonder, is there anything in these pages, 189 to 208, that hints at how energy works in these cycles of realization?
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. And while page 256 specifically is outside our scope right now, I think the underlying principle still applies, right? The idea that the ability to manifest things, actively, that it shifts depending on how different energy fields are interacting.
Okay.
And I think we can see that reflected in Velix even within these pages. For example, that rising figure, it's got this potential energy, right? And as it moves upwards, that potential becomes kinetic.
Ah, I see.
And the figure at the peak, maybe that represents a temporary balance between potential and kinetic energy. And then as it descends, that kinetic energy is changing, transforming back into a different kind of potential.
So the wheel isn't just spinning randomly, it's being powered by these shifts in energy states.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it.
Okay, cool. Now let's get back to the core pages here, 189 to 208. There's this concept mentioned, I think it's on pages 190 and 191, the private binder, and it talks about how inherently unstable it is. Can you break that down for me? What is that, and how does this idea instability relate to the Wheel of Fortune in IX?
The Gira, as it's described in these pages, it's basically referring to duality, to a pairing of opposites. And by its very nature, that kind of pairing creates a system that's prone to imbalance. Think of two magnets with opposite poles, right? They're attracted to each other, but there's also this tension, this push and pull. They can never really settle into a completely static state. And this instability, as it's discussed in those pages, it's directly mirrored in the Wheel of Fortune. The ups and downs, the shifting fortunes that Avex shows us, they're like outward manifestations of these underlying unstable binars. They're always seeking balance, but they can never quite achieve it permanently.
Got it. So that constant turning of the wheel, it's not just some random cosmic thing. It's tied to this fundamental instability within the very fabric of reality, as these pages explain it.
Exactly. And then the text goes on to say that this inherent instability leads to what it calls the objectification of individual interrelationships. Basically, it's saying that these unstable dualities, they become the basis for how we experience our connections with the world. And those experiences naturally are also subject to those same fluctuations and changes we see on the Wheel of Fortune.
So it's all connected. Now, there's another concept that's mentioned. It's on page 193, still within our 189 to 208 range. And it talks about the neutralization of binars. How does that idea fit into this whole picture of instability and cyclical change that Akis is showing us?
Yeah, the neutralization of binars is presented as a way of affirming and restoring essence to its original prototype. And it suggests that beyond all the surface level changes, beyond the instability of those keys, there's this deeper, more fundamental stability, a kind of return to unity, a core essence.
So like a still point in the midst of all the movement.
Exactly. Think of that wheel spinning rapidly, representing the push and pull of all those dualities. That neutralization is like finding the still point at the very center. It's a principle that remains constant despite all the changes happening around it.
So even amidst the chaos and change that Akis represents, these pages are saying there's this underlying, unchanging essence.
That's the suggestion, yes. The Wheel of Fortune shows us the dynamic, ever-shifting surface of reality, how it manifests through those binars. But the concept of their neutralization, that points towards a deeper, more unified ground of being, a grounding that's beyond all the fluctuations.
Wow, this has been a really in-depth look at OMIX, specifically pages 189 to 208. We covered a lot of ground, starting with how X emerges from IX, talking about realization as a move to this quaternary phase, the significance of the wheel and those figures, and how it all relates to these bigger principles of energy and change, and how we can actually use this knowledge to make better choices, all from these specific pages in the Isle of Us.
And how it all connects to these underlying dynamics of the Chugi, and even how they can be neutralized. It's quite a journey through just a few pages.
It is. So for you, our listener, what are the biggest takeaways from our deep dive into AX, specifically pages 189 to 208?
The key takeaway, I think, is that those cycles, the ups and downs, they're not random. They're fundamental to how reality works. And understanding that, recognizing those cycles of realization can give you a whole new perspective on your experiences, your life.
Your life isn't just a random series of events. There's a pattern there, a rhythm to it all.
Exactly. And these pages encourage us to not just observe those cycles, but to understand our role within them. The wheel might be turning, but we have the power to choose how we respond to its movement. That's huge.
So as you continue to navigate the complexities of your life, here's something to ponder. How can this deeper understanding of Iya, as revealed in those specific pages, how can that empower you to make more conscious, more mindful choices as you move through the inevitable changes on your journey?
That's a great question. I think maybe by recognizing the signs of a rising trend, you can seize opportunities more effectively. By understanding when things are at their peak, you can better prepare for the eventual shifts. And by accepting that decline is natural, you can learn to adapt and get ready for the next cycle of growth.
That's something to think about for sure. We encourage you to go back to those pages in the Asomito, revisit them with fresh eyes, and keep exploring these ideas.
And thank you for bringing these specific pages to our attention. This has been a fascinating exploration.
Absolutely. Until next time, keep diving deep and keep questioning.